Before his death, Johnny Carson revealed why he tried to ban Bob Hope. To the rest of the world, Bob Hope was untouchable. He was the face of American comedy, the man who flew into war zones to make soldiers laugh, the grandfather of stand-up who lived to be 100 years old. He was a hero. But if you ask Johnny Carson, the man who knew everyone in Hollywood better than they knew themselves, Bob Hope wasn't a hero. He was something else entirely. Something dark. Something empty. In the final years of his life, Johnny didn't just dislike Bob Hope. Insiders say he was actually afraid of him. Not afraid that Hope would hurt him physically, but afraid of what Hope represented. Privately, Carson described looking into Bob Hope's eyes as staring into a bottomless void. He told his closest circle that the man had absolutely no soul, no empathy, and no genuine connection to the human race. He was just a machine that needed applause to survive. For decades, they played nice on TV. But behind the curtain, a Cold War was brewing that would eventually reveal the disturbing truth about the most beloved comedian in history. This isn't just a story about two rich guys who didn't get along. This is the story of how Johnny Carson realized that his idol was actually a monster, and how he spent his entire career trying to make sure he didn't end up just like him. If you watch old clips of The Tonight Show, you see Johnny Carson laughing, slapping his desk, and wiping tears from his eyes whenever Bob Hope walked out. It looks like two best friends having the time of their lives. But that was Johnny's greatest acting performance. The reality? Johnny Carson absolutely dreaded the days Bob Hope was booked on the show. In fact, the staff called him the guest from hell. Here's how it usually worked with any other guest. They would come on, Johnny would ask them how they were doing, and they would have a genuine conversation. Maybe they'd tell a funny story about their kids or a vacation. It was natural. It was human. But with Bob Hope, humanity was not part of the contract. Bob Hope didn't converse. He didn't listen. When he came on The Tonight Show, he wasn't there to talk to Johnny. He was there to recite a script. He would walk out with a stack of cue cards, sometimes hiding them on the floor or having an assistant hold them just off camera, and he would just barrel through pre-written jokes. Johnny would ask, "So Bob, how's the golf game?" And Bob would answer with a completely unrelated one-liner about the president, because that's what was next on the card. It drove Johnny insane. You have to remember, Carson prided himself on being quick, witty, and in the moment. He was a jazz musician of comedy. Bob Hope was a player piano. He was just hitting the same notes over and over again. There were times when you could see the life drain out of Johnny's eyes live on air. He would sit there, forcing a fake laugh, tapping his pencil nervously, just waiting for Bob to finish his monologue so they could go to commercial. But it wasn't just the robotic nature of the interview that made Johnny despise him. It was the arrogance. Reports suggest that Bob Hope felt he owned The Tonight Show. He wouldn't wait for an invitation. If he had a new special to promote, he would supposedly just call the producers and say, "I'm coming on Thursday." It didn't matter if the show was already booked. It didn't matter if they had a young, up-and-coming comedian who needed that break. If Bob wanted the spot, Bob got the spot. Johnny watched talented young people get bumped from the lineup just so Bob Hope could come on and tell the same tired jokes he'd been telling since 1945. It was the first crack in the illusion. Johnny started to realize that this lovable uncle didn't care about the future of comedy. He only cared about himself. To understand why Johnny Carson eventually lost all respect for Bob Hope, you have to understand how they viewed comedy. For Johnny, comedy was an art form. It was about connection. For Bob Hope, comedy was a factory product. It was a numbers game. Bob Hope didn't write his own jokes. Now most comedians have writers. That's standard. But Bob Hope took it to a level that was almost industrial. He employed a massive staff of up to 100 writers at a time. He had a literal vault, a fireproof walk-in vault, in his home in Toluca Lake that contained over 7 million jokes, categorized by subject. If he needed a joke about potatoes, he'd go to the vault, pull out a file, and there it was. Johnny looked at this and saw it as soulless. He saw a man who had turned humor into a math equation. But what really turned Johnny's stomach was how Hope treated the people who built that vault. There have been numerous reports and biographies claiming that Bob Hope treated his writers like cattle. He didn't view them as creative partners. He viewed them as vendors. He paid them, but he rarely respected them. There's a famous story that circulated around Hollywood writers' rooms for years. It said that Bob would fire a writer for the smallest infraction, or sometimes just because he felt like shaking things up. He wouldn't do it face to face, of course. They would just stop getting checks. Contrast that with Johnny Carson, who was known for fiercely protecting his writers and giving them credit whenever he could. Johnny saw comedy as a way to cope with the world. Bob saw it as a transaction. I say funny thing, you clap, I get paid. That was the loop. And because Bob was so obsessed with volume, just cranking out content constantly, the quality started to dip. By the 1980s, Bob Hope specials were becoming notorious for being, well, bad. He would bring these clips to The Tonight Show to promote them, and Johnny's producers described them as looking like they were cut with a rusty knife. The timing was off, the jokes were dated, and the editing was a mess. But Johnny had to sit there, watch the clip, smile, and tell millions of Americans, "Boy, that looks great, Bob." It was eating him alive. He felt like he was lying to his audience. He felt like he was enabling a man who had stopped trying decades ago but refused to leave the stage. The biggest trick Bob Hope ever pulled was convincing the American public that he was everyone's best friend. He cultivated this image of the ultimate good guy. He was the man who spent his Christmases in freezing cold bunkers entertaining the troops. And look, nobody can take that away from him. He did do that. But Johnny Carson knew that doing good things doesn't necessarily make you a good person. Behind the scenes, the rumors about Bob Hope's character were dark. For a guy who played the wholesome American husband character, his reputation in Hollywood was anything but wholesome. It was an open secret that Bob Hope lived a double life. While he was married to his wife Dolores for 69 years, a number that the press always celebrated, insiders knew the reality was much more complicated. There were constant whispers about what really happened on those USO tours. Reports have surfaced over the years claiming that Bob Hope had a voracious appetite for women and that his fidelity to Dolores was non-existent. Now in Hollywood, affairs are common. But the way Bob allegedly handled them was cold. He was described by some associates as detached, treating intimate partners with the same transactional coldness he treated his writers. It wasn't about romance. It was about conquest. Then there was the money. Bob Hope was one of the wealthiest entertainers in history. He owned massive amounts of land across California. We're talking hundreds of millions of dollars. But despite this immense wealth, stories of his stinginess are legendary. He was known for never picking up a check. He would go out to dinner with writers or other comedians who made a fraction of what he made, and he would sit there in silence until someone else paid. Johnny Carson, on the other hand, was incredibly generous. He was known for tipping massive amounts and taking care of his people. Seeing Bob Hope, a man who had everything, act so selfishly with his money was just another piece of evidence for Johnny. It confirmed his theory. Bob Hope was a black hole. He took the applause, he took the money, he took the labor of his writers, but he never gave anything back. You might be thinking, maybe Johnny was just jealous. Maybe he was just being critical. But Johnny wasn't alone. The more you dig into Hollywood history, the more you realize that Bob Hope didn't really have friends. He had colleagues, he had audiences. But friends? That was a different story. Take Bing Crosby. On screen, Bob Hope and Bing Crosby were the ultimate duo. The road movies are classics. Their chemistry seemed perfect. But off-screen, it was a different movie entirely. Biographers have noted that while they respected each other's talent, they weren't spending their weekends barbecuing together. Bing Crosby was known to be distant himself, but even he reportedly found Bob Hope to be too much. There are stories that Bing Crosby would get annoyed by Bob's constant need to be on. Bob couldn't turn it off. If they were having a private conversation, Bob would be looking around the room to see if anyone was watching, trying to crack a joke for a waiter. He couldn't just exist as a human being. He always had to be Bob Hope. Johnny Carson saw this isolation, and it terrified him. Johnny was a loner, sure. He was socially awkward and preferred to go home and play drums or watch magic tricks rather than go to parties. But Johnny felt things deeply. He saw Bob Hope ending up as an old man surrounded by millions of fans, but with nobody who actually knew him. Bob had built a wall of jokes around himself so thick that nobody could get in. And the sad part was, Bob didn't seem to want anyone to get in. He was perfectly happy alone in that vault of jokes. The final straw for Johnny Carson, the thing that solidified his fear and disgust, was watching Bob Hope age. And this is the most heartbreaking part of the story. Most legends know when to bow out. They retire while they're still on top, leaving the audience wanting more. Johnny Carson was obsessed with this idea. He wanted to leave before he became a joke. Bob Hope did the opposite. He refused to leave. As he entered his 80s and then his 90s, his faculties started to decline. His hearing went. His eyesight failed. But he kept booking TV specials. He kept going on The Tonight Show. And it became excruciating to watch. There is a specific era of The Tonight Show in the late 80s and early 90s where you can see the pain on Johnny's face. Bob would come out and he couldn't hear Johnny's questions. Johnny would have to shout, "I said, how are you, Bob?" Bob would then squint at the cue cards, misread a joke, stumble over the punchline, and then wait for the applause. And the audience would clap, out of respect and pity. For Johnny, this was a nightmare scenario. He famously told his producer, Peter Lasalle, "If I ever end up like that, shoot me." He wasn't joking. Watching Bob Hope deteriorate on national television was the catalyst that pushed Johnny to retire in 1992. He looked at Bob and saw a ghost of Christmas future. He realized that Bob Hope had no life outside of show business. If he stopped performing, he would cease to exist. Johnny didn't want that. He wanted to prove that he could walk away. He wanted to prove that he was a human being first and a TV host second. So in a way, we have Bob Hope to thank for Johnny's perfect exit. Johnny left while he was still the king, because he was terrified of becoming the jester who wouldn't leave the court. When Johnny Carson finally retired, he disappeared. He went to Malibu, played poker with his buddies, and traveled. He barely gave any interviews. He lived the life he wanted. Bob Hope, meanwhile, kept working until he physically couldn't anymore. When Bob Hope finally passed away in 2003 at the age of 100, the tributes poured in. The world mourned the loss of a giant. But Johnny Carson's reaction was notably muted. He issued a polite statement, standard Hollywood protocol. But privately, the sentiment hadn't changed. It's been reported that in those final years, Johnny reflected on Bob's life as a cautionary tale. He saw a man who had conquered the world, but lost his soul in the process. He saw a man who had 100 years on this planet, but never seemingly had a deep, vulnerable moment with another human being. The void that Johnny saw in Bob's eyes wasn't evil in the way a serial killer is evil. It was the evil of emptiness. It was the tragedy of a man who loved the sound of clapping hands more than he loved his wife, his children, or his friends. Johnny Carson died in 2005, just 2 years after Bob. He died quietly, surrounded by family, with his dignity intact. He had successfully avoided the Bob Hope fate. But the feud, if you can call it that, remains one of the most fascinating psychological studies in Hollywood history. It was a battle between the man who wanted to be loved and the man who only wanted to be watched. So why does this matter today? Why should we care about two old guys who disliked each other? Because it reveals the dark side of fame that we still see right now. We see influencers and stars today who are desperate for that dopamine hit of likes and views, who film every second of their lives, who can't exist without an audience. Bob Hope was the original version of that. He was the first person to let the character consume the man. Johnny Carson saw the trap. He saw that if you feed the beast of fame too much, it eats you alive. He looked into the void of Bob Hope's eyes and he ran the other way. It makes you wonder, when we look at the biggest stars in the world today, the ones who are always on, the ones who never seem to take a break, are we looking at great entertainers? Or are we staring into that same bottomless void that terrified Johnny Carson? And speaking of Hollywood legends who hid dark secrets, if you think Bob Hope's story is disturbing, wait until you hear the truth about the man Johnny Carson called the most dangerous singer in Vegas. But that is a story for another time.